All right, turn your Bibles to 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 16. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 16. We studied a couple of weeks ago. I was out last week, vacation. Suzanne and I had a nice time. Actually, last Sunday we were in Henderson, worshiping with the congregation there, worshiping with Bracelyn and Ethan and Kara. And didn't be with them. But anyway, 2 Corinthians chapter 8, 2 Corinthians, let's just kind of go over a couple of things just to remind us of things we already know, things we've already talked about, but so that we keep these excuse me, in mind. Paul writes what we have is the second epistle to the church of Corinth. Now, Paul may have written as many as four, probably at least written three, and we don't know where the third one is at all, the fourth one. Some have believed that the last couple of chapters of 2 Corinthians is probably the third letter. It really doesn't matter. If God wanted us to have it, we'd have it, and that's really all that matters. But what we do have is this second epistle is instructive, but it's also it's an epistle where Paul is defending himself. Now, like I say, Paul will instruct, he will tell, he will teach, and he is in the 8th chapter, in the 9th chapter. He's teaching, he's reminding them of something, responsibility. But he's also going to, especially as we get into today, he is defending himself in his ministry. What's happened? Don't know. Did someone say something? Has someone been spreading gossip or slander? Seems as if that's probably the case. And Paul has to defend himself to the point of where he is trying to teach the church of Corinth to understand that what he has told them is truth, and they need to listen to it, and they need to follow it. When you get to the 8th chapter, as we began a couple of weeks ago, when you get into the 8th chapter, Paul deals with the idea of giving. Now, think about that in conjunction with 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians, the 16th chapter, especially, Paul talked about, to the church of Corinth, he talked about collection. And it was for the poor saints in Jerusalem that the churches were giving money in order to help the individuals that were going through very difficult times, hard times. And so when Paul writes to them, he tells them in 1 Corinthians, he says that upon the first day of every week that they're to give as they've been prospered. And that's, like I say, with the idea of the church treasury giving, excuse me, giving something to those folks that have a need. Then when you get to 2 Corinthians and you get to the 8th chapter, Paul is, first of all, the first thing that he does is that he is bragging on the churches, the church of Macedonia, or the churches, excuse me, of Macedonia in verse 1. And he is telling Corinth that the churches of Macedonia has done great in giving to the Lord. Now, they didn't give a tremendous amount from the standpoint of, oodles and bukus of dollars, but they were a poor church. And Paul says in verse 5, he says that they did not as we'd hoped, but they first gave themselves. They gave all they could give. And one of the things that talks about here in the first, say, 10 verses is that Paul says that they gave out of their poverty. And some have said that, well, that means that they gave to the point of being poor. And probably what it means is that in their poverty, they gave what they could. Instead of they gave till they didn't have any more, but they gave what they could out of the lack that they had, the lack thereof. A great example of that, of course, would be the poor widow, the widow's mite, and that story. Now, when you get into the 16th verse of 2 Corinthians 8, Paul continues this idea of collection, but the collection is, especially here, is with the idea of who's in charge of it. If you stop and think about it, and mentioned this before. If you stop and think about what do you know about Titus? I mean, what do we know about Paul? Well, we know his writings and so forth. So, but what do you know about Titus? Well, preacher, there's a book that's, got his name on it. Yes, but what do you know about Titus the man? Not a lot. There's not a whole lot. But one of the great things I think you can come up with out of this next paragraph that we're fixing to study is that Titus was a responsible individual that not only was responsible, but that Paul entrusted with an important ministry, an important work. And it seems as if Titus, at least one of his many responsibilities, was to go around to the churches and take up what they had dedicated or set aside or given that they wanted to give to the poor saints of Jerusalem. And he was going to take that money, and he was ultimately going to be in charge of gathering it and possibly distributing it, not Paul. And he did that out of a matter of, I'm sure, out of a matter of expedience, but also out of a matter of, we don't want any questions asked. We don't want there to be considered a conflict of interest. And that's pretty smart, especially if there were those that were already slandering Paul and slandering his ministry. So let's look at it. Thanks be to God. This is verse 16, 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 16. Thanks be to God, who puts the same earnest care for you into the hearts of Titus. In other words, thank God for Titus. Thank God for the fact that this is a ministry that he loves. This is a ministry that he wants. This is a ministry that he's eager to carry out. It's kind of interesting. He says it puts the same earnest. The New King James uses the word earnest. The Greek word means to hasten. It's the idea that this was important to him, to Titus. And Paul just says, thank God for him and for his ministry. For, verse 17, he not only accepted the exhortation, but being more diligent, he went to you of his own accord. And we have sent with him the brother whose praise is in the gospel throughout the churches. And not only that, but who was also chosen by the churches to travel with us with this gift, which is administered by us to the glory of the Lord himself and to show your ready mind. Paul says, thanks, Titus. He's accepted, we've challenged him. He's accepted this challenge. He wants to do it. It's a willing work. It's a work that he's evidently passionate about. And then he talks about this other individual that we've sent. And here's the question. Who in the world is it? Well, here's the answer. We have no idea. We don't know. Why didn't Paul say? I don't know. I mean, we could sit here and play devil's advocate and guess. A lot of writers in the early 1900s thought that they had the answer, and probably still think they have the answer, but they thought it was Luke. And it could very well have been. But to say, well, it was Luke, I don't think you can, because Paul doesn't mention who it is. And so we might sit and say, well, I wonder why he didn't mention who it was. Don't know. I mean, we could give suppositions and assumptions, but Paul just says that I've sent Titus. Titus is going to take on this ministry, and I've sent one whom we love that's well thought of, well known. I've sent him as well. And then he says in verse 20, avoiding this, that anyone should blame us in this lavish gift, which is administered by us, providing honorable things, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. Paul says Titus is going to take care of this, not me. That is, like I say, that holds down the idea of conflict of interest. That Paul is taking money, he's begging for money so that he can have more money. It's sort of like, every time I read this, I think about, it's sort of like the preacher going in and asking for a raise. It's not a comfortable thing to do. It's not fun at all. And a lot of folks say when the preacher starts talking about giving, he just wants more money. When he starts talking about the budget, he wants more money. And you get all of these things, and not all of that is true. Sometimes it is in certain situations in the past, not here, but in other places that I've been in. But at the same point in time too, that's what Paul says he wanted to keep down. People are already talking about his ministry. Why add something else? And so Paul says, he says, this is something that can be done this way, so that, as he says, providing honorable things, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of man. Folks will be all right with this. And he goes on and say, verse 22, and we have sent with them our brother, whom we have often proved diligent in many things, but now much more diligent because of the confidence which we have in you. If anyone inquires, about Titus, he's my partner, fellow worker concerning you. Or if our brethren have inquired about, they are messengers. The idea of messengers, they're sent ones of the churches, the glory of Christ. Therefore, show to them and before the churches the proof of your love and your boasting on our behalf, or on your behalf. So Paul Paul sends not one, but two people with Titus. And that was a pretty good idea. I mean, you didn't have Bank of Jerusalem to put money in. And so Titus would have been carrying a large sum of money around. And word would have gotten around, right? It always gets around. Word would have gotten around. Hey, Titus, you're looking for somebody to rob. Titus is the man. There were two others that were sent with Paul. Once again, we are with Titus. We have no idea. But Paul, in saying, okay, to Corinth, I've sent Titus. He's coming. He's in charge of this ministry. I've sent these other two guys. But here's the question that some of them must have had. Who's Titus? And Paul gives what amounts to just a few words in English. A quick recommendation. Paul's the reference, if you will, for Titus. And what does he say? He says, well, he's my partner and he's my fellow worker. He's my co-laborer. He's working with me. He's my assistant. And that should have sufficed. And evidently it did. But he said, here's what you need to know about him. You can trust him. He's one that is working for the glory of the Lord. But then he goes on in verse 24, before he gets into chapter 9, and talks about the administration of the gift. He says, show to them and before the churches the proof of your love, of our boasting on your behalf. In other words, he says, we've bragged about you. Now make sure that you carry through on that bragging. Show the proof of your love. There's an interesting thought there, sort of a side thought, if you will. Have you ever thought about your contribution being a proof of your love? Your love for your local congregation, your love for the work of the Lord, your love for the Lord. Now, we've been instructed to give as we've been prospered, to give as in accordance to what we have, and it doesn't have to be huge sums. If we have huge sums, that's wonderful. I was in Henderson, like I say, last weekend, and I was asking Ethan about where the new Freed-Hardeman has a new president. I said, where does he live? Well, Ethan showed me. It's a nice house, and it's actually, there were two houses that were right side by side. This lady had died back a year or so ago. She gave one of them to the church there in Henderson, and she gave the other house to Freed-Hardeman. And so that was her generous gift. Now, what she gave through her lifetime, I have no idea. Never met the lady that I know of or knew her. But she had those two. Like I say, she gave one to the church, and she gave one to the school. She did a great thing in many respects. Paul says, you want to show your love for God? Look at the checkbook. We can't do this as much anymore. I mean, we use debit cards, or I use debit card for just about everything. I've got a few dollars in my pocket, but very few, like I used to carry, because we use debit cards and credit cards, but we use debit cards. But go look at your bank account. See what you get. I think when Winkler wrote this years ago. He said, go through your checkbook, and he said, your register, and see what you give and see who has the most checks through the month and the amount, not just, number of checks, because you might have to go to the grocery store 2 or 3 times a week. You don't plan well or visitors come. But that might, you might figure out some things. Paul says, I want you to show your love for God. But he brags on them. He says, I know you will, but I want you to make sure that you show your love. Anything anybody like to say about the 8th chapter? Or ask? Well, the same subject is continued in the 9th chapter. He says, now concerning the ministering to the saints, it's superfluous for me to write to you, for I know your willingness. Kind of boast about them again, doesn't he? About which I boast to you, to the Macedonians. Now, think about this. In chapter 8, verse 1, he talks about the Macedonians, and he sort of boasts about them. Now, in the 9th chapter, and the end of the 8th chapter, 9th chapter, he's boasting about Corinth, and he says, not only am I boasting about you, Corinth, but I've boasted about you to the Macedonians, that Achaia was ready a year ago. They had made preparations, and your zeal has stirred up the majority. You are a great example. Now, Achaia they were Johnny on the spot. They had planned a year ago. How they did that, what exactly, to what extent, don't know. Maybe they had planned a budget, and a year ago they set aside money that was going to be given for this special collection. Maybe that's what he's saying. But he says, we know that you're going to do well, and we need you to know that you've been setting a great example. Your example has stirred up people. It's stirred up the majority. Yet, verse 3, I have sent the brethren, lest our boasting of you should be in vain in this respect, that as I said, you may be ready, lest if some Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, we, not to mention you, should be ashamed of this confident boasting. In other words, he says, we're coming. Be ready. Be ready. Be ready in coming, lest you don't show out like I figure you're going to. Therefore, verse 5, I thought it necessary to exhort the brethren to go to you ahead of time and prepare your generous gift beforehand, which you had previously promised, that it may be ready as a matter of generosity and not as a grudging obligation. He says, I want you to follow through. I want you to follow through on your promise. I made mention, in fact, a couple of weeks ago, one of the things that nonprofits, one of the problems is when they began to do some sort of funding campaign. And it's not just nonprofits, but say folks that have telethons. You don't see that as much anymore, but institutions that have telethons, and folks will say, well, they'll pledge X amount of dollars a month. A good portion of those folks that make those pledges never carry through for whatever reason. Maybe they got excited that, the emotion of the moment hit them and they pledged more than they could give. Maybe it's the fact that something came up unexpectedly, an emergency or something came up, or just their budget got tight. Who knows? Maybe they just didn't think through exactly how much they could get. Who knows why? And there are many different excuses, but they just sometimes don't follow through. And it's a large, I forget now the percentage, but it's a large percentage of nonprofits that encounter things like that in financial campaigns. Paul writes to the church of Corinth and he says, now we know what you've been talking about. We know what you've been planning. Now we need you to follow through. Because he says, we want you to do it. And notice in verse 5, it really tells us about our own individual giving, not just as a congregation, but as our individual giving. He says that it may be ready as a matter of generosity and not as a grudging obligation. In other words, he says, we want you to do this out of a heart of love. and a heart of generosity. Not because, oh, well, we got to. We got to. When we think about doing something out of generosity, we think that, okay, how's our giving to be? Well, our giving is to be as a sign of our love, but it's because we want to. The first work that I was ever in, so this was 100 years ago, there was a lady that actually sat in a class, a ladies' class, and I've had several talk to me about it. And this is what she said. The ladies were talking about giving, and she said, well, after the house payment, after the satellite payment, after the VCR payment, see, that's how it tells you how long ago it was. And she ran through several payments. After those payments, if there's anything left, we give to church. That's the way a lot of folks give. But that's not the way really it should be established. Individual giving that's out of a generous heart, a loving heart, plans for the Lord first, and then fixes their financials around that giving. Also says that you give as a matter of generosity. You give because you want to give. You give because you love to give. You give because you understand the mission and you want to help support the mission. Not, well, I got to do this. Oh, Smith, I think it was, in his commentary, made the statement. He says that what was a huge problem in Corinth at the idea of doing it quickly, for God loves cheerful giving. God wants someone that does this, not, oh, I don't want to give. You've heard the old stories, I'm sure, maybe even seen them. Maybe your family's been a part of them, of when the collection basket is passed. We don't do that much anymore. That's kind of interesting in Henderson last week. They didn't pass the Lord's Supper. You had to get that on your way in, but they did pass the collection plate. Not sure why. But anyway, they did do that. But you, like I say, you've seen it probably, or families done it. When you pass the collection plate, and you've given your child some money to put in the collection plate, and then they either don't want to give it, or you have to shake their hand in order, because and you think you're teaching them something. You're teaching them a valuable lesson. But at the same time, too, you're thinking, yeah, that's the way a lot of adults are. They're giving, but they don't want it. Paul says, don't do it grudgingly. Don't do it out of necessity or compulsion, but he says, do it out of a cheerful heart. For God is able, verse 8, to make all grace abound towards you, that you always, having all sufficiency in all things, may have an abundance for every good work. Well, I think that's where our Malachi passage, for at least me, comes in. He says, God will take care of you. God will give you what you need. Be generous. As it is written, verse 9, He has dispersed abroad, He has given to the poor. His righteousness endures forever. God's workers don't have to beg. God will supply. Now, may He who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food supply and multiply the seed you have sown and increase the fruits of your righteousness, while you are enriched in everything for all liberality, which causes thanksgiving through us to God. Verse 10 reminds us of something, or at least, once again, this is me, okay? Verse 10 reminds me that the money that I have is really not mine. Oh, wait a minute, preacher. I've worked for it. I've sweated for it. I have labored intensely. I have labored purposefully. I have labored passionately. And I have labored at times when I didn't want to labor, but that money is mine. No, that money is the Lord's. You're a steward of it. You're a caretaker of it. In graduate school, I had taken a couple of ethics classes in undergraduate, but in graduate school, I took an ethics class, Ralph Gilmore. And I love Ralph, and Ralph could be retired now. Ralph could be really hard. But in graduate school, I took a class, and it was on Christian ethics. And we studied, of course, the basis of ethics, which I had all that before. But then we got into studying individual ethics. And you know the first thing we studied, which was strange to me right at first, and then I got to thinking about it and I thought, no, it makes sense. The first thing we studied from an ethical standpoint, you would say, oh yeah, a bunch of preachers. Y'all studied abortion and capital punishment. Well, we studied that. First thing we studied was how to take care of planet Earth. And what is our responsibility as Christians to take care of planet Earth? Well, we studied it first because that was the first chapter in the book we were required to read. But the reality of it is that you do that thinking and understanding because we're just caretakers. And we don't have a problem understanding that. Oh, yeah, planet Earth was here before we got here. And if the Lord hasn't come again when we pass away, it'll still be here. And it's really not ours. It's the Lord. Now, we may own a piece of it. We have titles to deeds to lands. And so those things are ours by virtue of law, but they're not really ours. What we have is a gift that God is simply saying, this is your time to use it as you see fit. Now, I want you to use it for my glory, but it's your time to use it as you see fit. God supplies. You're just the steward. You're just the caretaker. You're just the one watching over it, and you're taking care of it for me. Now, how are you going to do that? So he says, God will take care of it. God will provide. And he says in verse 11, notice what he says, while you are enriched in everything for all liberality, which causes thanksgiving through us to God. We're thankful. But we're thankful for your liberality. We're thankful that you're liberal in your giving. You might say, preacher, I don't want to be liberal. I want you to be liberal in your giving. Generous is the idea. 4, verse 12, the administration of this service not only supplies the needs of the saints, but also is abounding through many thanksgiving to God. Think about what he says. It helps people. This money helps people. But also, he says, not only does it help people, not only does it supply to the needs of the saints, but it also is abounding through many, thanksgiving to God. It shines and comes through. And folks are able to thank God for what you have and for what you do. While through the proof, verse 13 of this ministry, they glorify God for the obedience of your confession to the gospel of Christ and for your liberal sharing with them and all men. And by their prayer for you, who long for you because of the exceeding grace of God in you. He says, this is the proof of your ministry. This is the proof of your service. This is the proof of who you are. Now, Paul understood because of what he taught in 1 Corinthians. Paul understood not everybody can give the same amount. Paul understood that. Paul understood that some have more, some have been in charge, if you will, of taking care of more. They're stewards of greater amounts than others. And so it's never been a matter of everybody has to give $20. I was sitting in a meeting, the congregation I was working with at the time, and we were about to build more. We needed to. We needed to build. We really needed. If we were going to have fellowships, we needed to build a fellowship hall. We were using the basement, and it was just not conducive to carrying things downstairs. But they had done it for years. But it was time. It was past time. We had the property right there, right behind the church building. We couldn't exactly join it to the building because of fire codes and all the good things that go along with laws. but it's right there. It's within I think it's 12 feet from the building, 10 to 12 feet from the building, whatever the law allowed us to get that close. And so we were sitting in a meeting. It was the elders, the deacons, the preacher, and me. I was the associate minister. And the preacher made a whole lot more money than the associate preacher made. Whole lot more. And anyway, but he had many years there and so forth. So in the meeting, he said, he speaks up and he says, every one of us in this room ought to give, and he said, X amount of dollars. I thought, nope, Suzanne and I can't do that. And I also thought, no, this is individual. This is not, you give what you want to give and what you can give, and the rest of us will give, it's none of your business. To be honest, the way I felt about it, that's between me and the elders. And I had a very good relationship with those elders, and I knew they'd understand if I had to talk to them about it, but I knew also they wouldn't talk to me about it because they understood it was individual. Anyway, I'm sitting in that meeting, he says that, and I'm thinking, and one deacon speaks up and he says, now some of you, and he didn't have a lot. He says, now some of you may be able to do that. But he said, my wife, we can't. They had 2 kids in college. There's just no way. And they both had jobs, but they weren't super high paying jobs. And we just can't do it, right? And the elders, of course, immediately spoke up and said, yeah, you give what you want to give. You give what you can give. Well, that's the idea. Paul is saying here, give what you can give. But it's the idea of giving. And he says, this is the proof of your ministry. God has glorified this. The church is. Reality is, I know heaven's not going to be literal, it's pearl streets gold. I get that. But I come away with this understanding. Every time I look at, especially Revelation 21, 22, I come away with this understanding. Heaven is going to be so great. John describes it in the best way he possibly can. But heaven is going to be so great that while I can't get my head around it, I don't want to miss it. I don't want to miss it. I want to go. Suzanne and I went to Cincinnati last week, week before last now, for our vacation for a few days. And Suzanne's our travel consultant. And so, she finds out what's there and what she wants to do. And I'm smart enough to say, yes, ma'am. And so, we tempered one of the things that she wanted to do because I said, Suzanne, it is very hot outside. She said, yeah, let's don't go. I said, thank you. So we didn't go to that one attraction, but we went to other things and had a great time. But you think about, okay, these are what I want to do. This is what I want to say. Oh, heaven's that way. I don't want to miss it. I want to go. I want to be there. I want to see it. I want to spend eternity. Because then, if you're like me, I try to wrap my head around the idea of eternity. Can't do that either. I can tell you, it's going to be a drop in the bucket compared to whatever you think it is time-wise. But anyway, I think, okay, that was a great blessing. Paul says, God's given us the gift of blessing. And we need to thank God for it. There's a lot in that chapter and some things I just kind of skipped over. Anything you might like to say? Brad. Well, you know, you always ask how good is our giving and could we do better? And probably all of us could do better in our giving uh, than what we give. Probably, maybe not, but it's individual, and families must sit down and look at it. And Suzanne, usually I sit down and look at it, and I tell Suzanne, I said I'll tell her what I think we can give. Here's what's coming in. Here's what we need to give, and Suze is very good. Yes, that's fine. And then if anything else comes up, Suzanne wants to always give a little bit more, and so we try our best, and I'm sure you do as well. Anyway, chapter